right. The warm-up act here. This is really exciting to me to be here, and I'm gonna read from a novel that right now looks like it's gonna come out next year. I haven't actually figured out the title yet, but it deals with the way that the U.S. uses its military around the world. We often talk about conflicts in discrete terms: the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Colombia. Or maybe you're not as familiar with the war in Colombia. Colombia's been the largest recipient of military aid from the United States in the Western Hemisphere since the end of the Clinton administration. And we keep ping-ponging people back and forth between conflicts. Every ambassador to Colombia post 9/11 has gone to work in Afghanistan or Pakistan. 2 ambassadors we sent right from Colombia to be the ambassador to Afghanistan next, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I'll just start with the opening. The first half of the novel is told in 4 voices, 2 of them American, 2 of them Colombian. And this is from one of the Colombians. My town sat on top of a small hill by the side of a river whose banks held only sand. At noon you had to walk quickly so as not to burn your feet, but when it rained the river would overflow and turn our central street to mud. All us children would go out, slipping and pushing each other, playing in the mud before the sun baked it hard and the wind carried it away as dust. To talk about this part of my life is to talk about another person. Like a person in a story, a boy with a mother and a father and 3 sisters, one pretty, one smart, and one mean. A grandfather who drank too much and beat everyone at dominoes, a teacher who thought the boy had talent, a priest who thought he was wicked. Friends and classmates and enemies and girls he watched with increasing wonder, like Jimena, who had thick, curly hair and fair skin and who got pregnant with the baby of one of the local guerrilla. Most people think that a person is whatever you see before you, walking around in bone and meat and blood. But that's an idiocy. Bone and meat and blood just exists. But to exist is not to live, and bone and meat and blood alone is not a person. A person is what happens when there's a family and a town, a place where you are known, where every person who knows you holds a small, invisible mirror, and in each mirror held by family and friends and enemies is a different reflection. In one mirror, the sweet, fat boy I was to my mother. In another, the little imp I was to my father. In another, the irritating brat I was to Gustavo. A person is what happens when you gather all these reflections around a body. So what happens when one by one the people holding those mirrors are taken from you? It's simple. The person dies, and the bone and meat and blood goes on, walking the earth as if the person still existed, when God and the angels know he doesn't. So let's not talk about this boy as if he and I are the same person and not 2 strangers, one who walked in this body before the burning and one who did after. Let's talk about this boy whose memories and face I share as the dead child he is. We can call him Avelito. Avelito was a fat, well-loved child. Every day he would walk to school in another town, a school run by men from America who taught math and reading, but also about the personal Jesus and how a group of priests called the Jesuits had stolen the Bible and changed the words to make men follow the devil. True story. The Lord would overcome and save us if we had faith, they said, and faith was a moment when the heavens shined down and we knew we were saved. The mean sister, Mona, said that she had been saved and that it felt very, very good, but that Abelito hadn't had the feeling yet because he was going to hell. 2 weeks later, Mother took him 2 towns down to the church in Cunovice to get confessed, and when Abelito told Father Eustacio about Mona's salvation, the old priest had scowled and said it was stupidity, that only a cruel God would condemn and save in such a foolish way, and that God was not cruel, but he was, in fact, a terrible and frightening love. And he took that little boy out of the confessional to see the skin and bones Holy Christ above the altar, a wooden Holy Christ in agony with muscles straining and a bloody wound in its side like a mouth. The statue gave Abuelito nightmares. But Father Eustacio said to look on the suffering and know the love of God, to do such a thing to his child. God is love, Father Eustacio said, and he does not hand out salvation to be worn like a crown. And Abuelito said, my sister then? She's not saved? And Father Eustacio said, no. Good, thought Abuelito. And after that day, Abuelito nodded his head when the missionaries talked about the personal Jesus who would come to them and make them born again, but in his secret heart he remained faithful to the terrifying Holy Christ of Cuneviche. So that is the opening of the novel. And another character is American Special Forces, and he starts out in Iraq. And Special Forces are supposed to be the warrior diplomats, are supposed to work with local forces and do sort of more engagement with the people. But we increasingly, especially in Afghanistan, started using Special Forces just as direct action troops. And the kind of culture of that unit changed in a way where it became more about chasing combat than achieving any kind of broader sustainable stability. And so this character is sort of gradually becoming more and more disillusioned, which is what has happened with what has happened in his unit. And in 2007, 1st Battalion, the 7th Special Forces Group, had an extremely violent deployment to Afghanistan. And I'm just going to read from a chapter about that. It started with the fireworm, a 5-kilometer-long convoy in Helmand, everything we had in one beastly formation, the only American force in the district, civilization descending into the wilderness, lighting up the first few Taliban brave enough to fire on us, chalking up the first couple deaths to the deployment tally before hitting the turnoff for Highway 611, turning due east, off-roading into the desert, heading parallel to Sangin, and then, exactly at noon, flooding the town, taking it without a fight. With a base of operations established, the colonel adopted a strategy of sending out small teams, 12 Americans plus some Afghans, to draw the Taliban out so we could call in air support on them. Our deadliest weapon, as per usual, was our radio. And all of us were glad to be back in the thick of things, even if it sometimes took its toll. Fucking bullshit, Carlos told me as I handed him a few Motrin. I forgot about the goddamn headaches. Everybody only remembers the cool parts of combat, I told him. I'd forgotten them as well, the headaches, the sleeplessness, the frayed nerves that were all part of the game. We lost people. In May, a Chinook got shot down, 8 died in the crash, and we had to fight a running gun battle to get through to recover the bodies. In June, an IED took out Cliff Weeks, a well-liked team sergeant from another ODA. July, 2 more dead, one from small arms fire and another from a pressure plate rigged to an artillery shell, an old-school IED method, one of the classics that never goes out of style. And that's not counting the injuries, the gunshot, shrapnel wounds, and lost arms and legs and fingers and eyes. If there's a heaven for limbs, a waiting room in paradise where the severed parts await reunion with their owners, we put in some work filling it up. We gave better than we got. After one battle in Zerkau, 136 dead. Amazing at the time to think battles that big were still happening. That the Taliban was still sending so many people, so many of them so young, into our meat grinder. Hovering above that wonder, the knowledge that they were sending so many to their deaths time and time again because they could. Blood, as they say, makes the grass grow. In Afghanistan, it grew tall. Benji, our new engineer, said, all the guys we're killing, you'd think the Taliban would be collapsing. All Hefe had in response was, it takes time. We'd been at war here for 6 years, Benji had said. By year 6, World War II was over. Back then, there were a grand total of 30,000 troops in the country. The army was gearing up to pour bodies and equipment into Iraq because of the surge, while out in rural Afghanistan, it took 2 months to get mission-critical replacement parts because Iraq. Even if we decided to forget about 90% of the incredibly rural Afghanistan and just secure the big cities, Kabul, Jalalabad, Mazar-e-Sharif, and Kandahar, we couldn't have done it. So, how do you secure Afghanistan? Cede 0 territory to the Taliban, promote local governments, and develop local forces and courts and economic growth with 30,000 troops. You don't. So we didn't promise the Afghans money for roads or schools or improved health care or better governance. Everybody, especially the Afghans, knew that wasn't what we were there for. And then I'll skip ahead. There's a battle The 1st Battalion, 7th Special Forces Group fought in this one valley in Afghanistan where there'd been a battle a couple years before that they fought alongside a bunch of Canadian tankers. And this is in the middle of the fight. Hefe pushed the PKM gunner inside, and while he fired down the hallway, we cleared the rooms. From a window, I saw an RPG fly towards Carlos in the gun truck. Carlos shifted fire and reduced a grape hut to Ruddle. We moved to another building, cleared it, then cleared another and another. As we moved forward, the gun truck moved forward too. Then there was an enormous flash. Hefe looked at me, and I looked back at the gun truck. The bomb had exploded underneath one of the back wheels, setting off the gas tanks and the jerry cans of fuel's flames arced up towards the sky as the truck jumped, equipment flying everywhere, and Carlos in the turret launched straight up. His arms spread out, hands clutching empty air as his body twisted, and then he fell back down, landing on the front of the truck. I was too far away to hear anything, and even if I'd been close, the machine gun fire would have covered over the sound, but in my memory of it, I always hear the thud. I ran across the field, machine gun fire all around me, not quite registering, reached the truck and hauled Carlos heavy with all his gear to the ground. His uniform was on fire, and I burned myself trying to smother the flames. Rounds started cooking off in the burning truck. Inside was more than 20,000 7.62 rounds, 10,000 5.56, as well as rockets, mortars, recoilless rifle rounds, and grenades, all of which would soon be exploding. I grabbed Carlos around the underarms and started hauling him to an irrigation ditch about 10 meters away, just by the side of a marijuana field. As I pulled, an explosion in the truck sprayed us with hot frag. I kept pulling, my lungs burned, and my blistered hands screamed at me. There was machine gun fire raking the open spaces around us. We reached the ditch and collapsed in, only to find it no more than 18 inches deep. "Fuck!" I screamed, then rolled over to assess Carlos, who looked up at me calmly, not in shock. "Benji," he said. I looked back at the truck, ablaze. Behind it, just up the hill, a dark figure. The explosion must have blown Benji through the driver's door and into the hill, saving his life. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Hefe sprinting his way towards Benji. He moved fast for an old man. "Leaking from the hip, bro," Carlos told me. A piece of frag had punched through his hips, shredding his stomach and intestines, spraying splinters of hip bone through the abdomen. Clearly the major injury. I scanned the rest of the body. One leg, shredded, bent horribly, bleeding profusely, due for an amputation at some point if he survived. I quickly applied a tourniquet. Easy. He had burns to his hands, face, unimportant. The patient, not Carlos, but the patient, had sustained a hell of a blow. In an hour or so, systemic inflammatory response would hit. The bowel and abdomen wall would swell, oxygenation would drop, and the patient would need massive fluid resuscitation, possibly inotropic support. He was in the golden hour, and I started packing the hip and abdomen, trying to keep the organs sterile on the inside, trying to give him the best chance of surviving those 60 minutes. Packing from without is creating a sandwich. I could hear the instructors at Special Forces Medical Training Center telling me packing from within is filling a cavity. 2 layers of pads on either side of the liver supported by the abdominal wall and the diaphragm. My heartbeat had kicked into 5th gear, but my movements were controlled. There's something beyond control, past clenched fist, bare-knuckled will, and towards a natural set of movements flowing from the training, bypassing language and thought as my chattering brain whined on, reciting injuries and treatment options, but the voice increasingly distant as my hands worked. "Are you in pain?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Hip, stomach, Jesus, leg, right leg, face." His beard was smoking, so was mine, I realized. Okay, I said, "I got you. You have to ask about the pain." Carlos's pain, when talking to him about his pain, he was Carlos again, not the patient. It would be the life kind of pain. The kind that from this point would ebb and flow, but never quiet. Asking about pain at the site of the injury is a way of treating that chronic pain. They're not sure how it works, other than that it does. Perhaps, since pain is emotion plus sensation, reflecting care and concern and the promise of help to the patient somehow changes things. So we ask about the pain. And so I asked about the pain. And Carlos tried to tough it out. "Stop the bleeding first," he said. I guess he thought I was going to bust out the drugs. I grinned at him. "I don't tell you how to do your job." I moved from the liver to the right gutter, packed it, I shifted, put my left hand above the spleen, pulled it toward me, packed above the spleen, moved to the left gutter, then the pelvis, noted accumulation of blood from a mesenteric bleeder. I stopped that with a finger, then I used a clamp. I didn't like the blood flow. I pulled the stomach down, pushed 2 fingers past it, slippery, rubbery, until I could feel the aorta. It pulsed under my fingers. This is life, I thought. I looked at Carlo's face, which was pale, serene. I compressed the aorta manually. Hefe arrived at the ditch with Benji, who saw how shallow it was. Are you fucking kidding me? There was a stench of vomit. He'd probably puked all over himself from breathing in the toxic smoke of the truck. Taliban were shooting at us directly now, bullets slicing through the marijuana over our heads. If I get shot in the ass, Hefe said, as he pulled off Benji's body armor, checking him head to toe. Benji's fine, I said. Carlos is in the golden hour. Kazovac is 20 minutes out, Hefe said. Huge explosions roared in the hills, the Canadian Leopards opening fire. Azad Khan appeared at my side with a stretcher. I could have kissed the ugly bastard. We got Carlos on the stretcher, started moving. Hefe helped Benji to his feet, and then, when Benji collapsed, carried him. Behind us, the truck continued to burn. Ahead of us, the CCP, littered with needle cases, discarded bandage wrappers, tubing, shed straps of clothing, and in the midst of the chaos, covered in blood, Ocho. I pushed fluids into Carlos as well as antibiotics. Later, his body would be too weak to fight the incoming infections from all the dirt and grime and evil pushed into his body before they had a chance to really grip him. The fucking Dutch, Hefe told me at one point, can't identify targets and won't go below their ceiling. Ah, I thought. So that's why we don't have air support. Carlos seemed certain he was going to die. He'd alternate between joking and telling me things to tell his ex-wife, who'd left him after he cheated on her with a stripper in Fayetteville. I pumped him full of painkillers, kept him talking. Even if he survived the golden hour, I knew something he'd soon learn, that you never fully shake the finger of death once you've been injured like this. Survivors age faster, 2 to 4 times as fast, though the doctors don't really know why. The diseases of old age, coronary artery disease, chronic kidney disease, hypertension, diabetes, strike earlier. It's like the body knows it wasn't meant to live. But there we were, Ocho and I, working with his blood drying on our clothes, pushing life as he lay helpless to stop us, the two of us conspiring against his body's right to die. We put him in a Kazovac, unsure if he'd live. It wouldn't be until the fight was over that we'd receive definitive word he'd made it, or at least made it through the worst. And the fight continued for 2 more days, with a body count somewhere around 400 Taliban killed by the end. After the fighting, the people started filtering back to their towns, and I watched them, wondering what they were wondering. If they were wondering who they lost, how many of their brothers or fathers or sons were simply never coming home again. Diego pointed to a little boy holding hands with his littler brother. The boy had a mop of black hair, messy, like old pictures of the Beatles. In a couple years, he said, you think we'll come back and kill him? I scowled and Diego laughed. You know what's crazy, he said? Between 2001 and now, life expectancy in Afghanistan has gone up. I didn't respond. I know. 55 years to 57, that's how fucked up this country is. This war has actually been good for their health. Ah, I said. I wasn't interested in playing Diego's games. I treated my own wounds, small burns and little bits of frag that had ripped little tears across my neck, face, and right arm. All would mostly heal with minor scars, nothing like Carlos. There are 2 ways to think about severe wounds. One is the very smallness and weakness of the human body, pathetic even compared to other animals, so easy to break beyond repair, so easy even with the most basic of tools, a rock is enough. And then to think of it in the midst of the sorts of things that happen in war. Not just explosions sending earth and brick blossoming into the air, but weapons that work by strange inversions of pressure. Collapse buildings from the inside or concentrate force in small spaces that liquefy metal and send it shooting out through the air. The penetration of the human body is so easy, it almost seems beside the point. Such tools should be used for greater creatures than us. We're weak, we're fragile, perhaps we're nothing. There's wonder in the world, the unbearable blackness of the sky in Afghanistan, its piercing stars, the vibrations of the guns, soundless light on the horizon, flashes like echoes, a moon rising over sharp blades of mountain while tracers carve lines into the night. But man himself is nothing. But the other way of thinking is the opposite, that it's the world that's small. Mountains, stars, horizon, so much accumulation of rocks, dust, and an expanse of empty air, meaningless without someone there to see it. I was once shot in the shoulder. The world around me wobbled and vibrated and collapsed to nothing in the midst of the pain. I applied my mind to the pain, oriented myself, returned the world to its proper place around me. I thought of my brothers who I was currently failing by no longer being in the fight, by being injured, perhaps badly enough that I would need their help leaving this place. Whoop. Where is the next page? I have no idea. There we are. That I would need their help leaving this place, under fire, when they had enough to carry without me. I thought of my wife and daughter, And then I looked at my arm, flopped to the side, immobile, mere matter, a thing, meaningless. And I applied my mind to the pain, and a finger wiggled, dead flesh suddenly live. There was a miracle there in the difference between the two. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thanks, Phil. It is such a privilege to be here. Thank you all. My name is Kirstin Valdez Quade, and so for the last several years, I've been working on a novel, which is finally done. And against the good advice of several teachers and friends, during the writing of that novel, I cheated on that novel a lot, and I wrote a bunch of short stories. And so I'm working now on a collection of short stories that are retellings of saints' lives. And in these retellings, I stay pretty close to source documents. It's important to me that I really respect those early accounts of the saints' lives. But my project in this collection is to try to carve out space in those stories to explore the lives of people around the saints, or sometimes the saints themselves, that felt like they'd been overlooked or simplified or dismissed. So today I'm going to read two pieces in this collection, and I promise they're short. The first one is a very short story about a fresco in my favorite church in Rome, which I stumbled into the first time I went to Rome. It was 106 degrees, and I was lost, and I sort of staggered into this church complex, mostly because it was cool. And there was a fresco, a 12th century fresco, that just took my breath away. So this is called Santi Quattro Coronati. On the right wall of the basilica is a fragment of a fresco of San Bartolomeo. He's a bearded old man, mouth obscured by damage, his eyes suspicious. His own wrinkled pelt is thrown over his shoulder like a traveling cloak. No longer the cheerful dandy, dressed in white with swinging purple tassels. He took good care of that white tunic. For 20 years across all those distances, it never showed signs of wear. No, there on that wall, he lives immortal as he died, flayed bare. The son of the one who holds the waters on high, travels the earth, path marked by bloody footprints. Jerusalem, Kalyan, Albanopolis, Lipari. Each trailing finger leaves a red smear. He kneels 100 times a day and 100 times at night, speaks the tongues of all peoples, casts demons from girls and stones and idols. His bones will wash up on distant shores. How terrible to carry one's skin like a scarf, nerves sparking at each shift in the air. Can we blame him for his wary gaze? San Bartolomeo, teach us to live naked before the beauty and suffering of this world. At this moment, we are reminded, he knows what we are talking about. So now I will read just two brief sections from a short story, which was the first short story, the story that sort of started this project. And I wrote this story in Toby Wolf's class, and so I thank him for his comments on it. So this story is based on the life of a 12th century Belgian holy woman, Christina the Astonishing. And I was reading Margot H. King's translation of Thomas de Contempré's account of her life, and it's an amazing account. This woman, she must have suffered so horribly, and she was horrible. She would sit in treetops and screech at passing people, screeching that she could smell their sins, and they repulsed her, and they made her sick, and she was constantly flinging herself into rivers and fires, and it seemed very stressful for the people around her. And in sort of a throwaway line, Thomas de Contempré mentions her sisters, and I thought, wow, imagine being her sister. So I did. So this is called Christina the Astonishing, 1150 to 1224, and it starts with an epigraph from Thomas de Cantimpré. Nevertheless, her sisters and friends never stopped their persecution, for after she had returned to a place where they could seize her, they bound her fast with a heavy wooden yoke and fed her like a dog with only a little bread and water. No one there had compassion for her wretchedness. So this story is from the point of view of one of her sisters, and this is just two sections of the longer piece. Here begins the life of the Holy Christina. May of 1150 is unseasonably cold, and on the morning that my youngest sister is born, ice glazes the budding trees. Since dawn, Gertrude and I have been waiting outside the house, leaning against the windowsill, the sleeves and fronts of our dresses smudged with whitewash. Our father is away with the flock, due back in a few days, so only Gertrude and I keep watch. Gertrude clutches a softening parsnip in her arms, murmurs to it. She's 5, 13 months younger than me, already a red-lipped beauty, already a little mother. We try to peer through cracks in the shutters, listening to the cries within, but can't make out our mother in the murk. Outside, everything is bright and still. No wind blows over the frozen ground. There is no bird song at all this year. The birds have abandoned the Meuse Valley entirely for somewhere warmer, Spain maybe. She won't live, the midwife tells us on her way out. She tightens her shawl, then says over her shoulder, "The baby, I mean, I'm sorry. Your mother just needs to rest." We watch her move down the road to the village. Our mother has lost babies before, so this news is sad but expected. It's our mother we're worried about. With pounding hearts, Gertrude and I hold hands and step into the house. Inside, the air is hot from the stoked fire, thick with the smell of blood and smoke. Our mother turns her face from the light, or maybe she turns her face from us and presses her cheek to the bedclothes. Christina, our new sister, flails naked on a cloth before the fire, blue-white and thin, full of mucus and outrage. "Give her here, Mara," our mother says in a watery voice. Tears leak from the corners of her slit eyes. We kneel beside our squalling sister. Gertrude sets down her parsnip gently, and we wrap her in the warmed cloth with our 4 clumsy hands. "Can she be my doll when she's dead?" Gertrude asks. "Idiot," I tell her kindly. "She'll rot and stink like any dead thing." But Christina doesn't die. As a scowling infant, she rejects the breast. Later, she picks at her suppers. Yet she grows in spite of herself. At night, as Gertrude and I bend over our carding, Christina watches us, sharp-eyed and peevish, breathing wetly. The saint's childhood. We sell our sheep in the markets of Rustem and Ordingen and Saint-Tron. The 3 of us accompany our father. Gertrude and I hurry the sheep when they lag with a whack on their spongy bottoms. Christina will not keep up, and she won't keep to the road either, but darts along from tree to tree, the underbrush snapping at her feet. Our father no longer raises his voice or drags Christina by the wrist or whips her for lollygagging. He could yell himself hoarse and whip his arm crippled, and still Christina wouldn't obey. Only 8 years old, and already she stymied him. One day, as we pass the great walled convent of St. Catherine's on the road to Saint-Tron, the door is open to allow a cart to pass through. "Gertrude," I say, and grab her sleeve, because we've never seen the gate open. We peer into the cobbled yard while the porter argues with the driver and the sheep nudge our thighs with the bony points of their heads. The morning light seems warmer beyond the gatehouse. There, pink in the rising sun, is the chapel, with its crown of slender finials. There, the abbey, all carved arches and gray stone. At the far end of the yard, an archway opens onto another courtyard, beyond which I glimpsed a garden. I ache to be there, enclosed in that spot of green, to live day after measured day of prayer and work, each as full and serene as a rosary bead. It is 6 a.m. The sisters are in the chapels reciting prime. Somewhere behind these walls, the cloisters are quiet and waiting. Somewhere else, lay sisters tend to bees in straw apiaries or bend with rakes over rows of waxy cabbages. Then reins are shaken, the cart rattles through, and the gate is shut. "They found a baby in the walls," Gertrude says. She takes my arm and gives a ram a kick in the side. A tiny little skeleton. A nun had it in secret and closed it into the wall. Liar, I say. It's true. Gertrude presses her red lips, tosses her braid over her shoulder. Isn't it awful? A defenseless little baby. She widens her eyes as if she just had a delicious thought. Maybe it wasn't dead. Maybe it was still gurgling when she bricked it in. That doesn't even make sense. Where would a nun get masonry tools? Poor Mara. Gertrude touches my cheek in mock sympathy. They wouldn't take you anyway, not with a sister possessed by the devil. We laugh and turn to watch Christina charging through the leaves, head forward, shoulders hunched and purposeful. She glances furtively over her shoulder, then hides behind an oak. Soon she peers around the trunk, eyes narrowed and suspicious, and when she catches us looking, her expression is one of such loathing that the laugh withers in my throat. Gertrude shudders and squeezes my wrist. Don't go, swear you won't go and leave me with her. Hurry up, Christina, I shout in a rage. Her hand is motionless on the gnarled bark. When she speaks, her voice is so shrill you could cut your finger on it. Leave me alone. There is, of course, no money to pay my dowry to the convent, and though I pray and cry and beg God and my parents, this fact does not change. I apply to the abbess through our parish priest, but the sisters won't take me as an oblate or a charity case. Just as well, my father says. We couldn't spare you, my mother says. They mean, but they don't say, that Christina is becoming yet stranger. Neighbors find her curled tight in their pig pens, crouched like an animal in ditches along the roads, hidden in the marsh grass, knee-deep in stinking mud. Left alone, the sheep wander. Some are recovered in the woods among the trees. Some are never found at all. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Randy Boyagoda, and if it's not clear from my brown face, I'm from Canada. Very happy to be here today. I see a lot of people in the crowd who I've seen at various other conferences, and I'd like to thank some of you for really creating a context for me to think about the Catholic imagination, to read from this novel as it was sort of developing over the last few years. Particularly, I'd like to thank Commonweal for running an excerpt from this before it was published. And then likewise, it really means a lot to get a chance to read in front of Tobias Wolff. I don't think I would be interested in the relationship between the imagination and my faith were not for In the Garden of the North American Martyrs, which was a life-changing book, a story for me 20 years ago. So I'm going to read to you today from my new novel, Original Prin. It's the story of a bike-riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor teaching at a failing Catholic college in downtown Toronto. This has nothing to do with my day job. The college is facing shutdown unless it opens a satellite campus in the Middle East. And for any number of mixed motives, some higher, some much lower, Prin, the main character, volunteers to go to a country called Dragomans, just emerging from a civil war, to help open a satellite campus to keep his university in Toronto thriving, or at least open. He goes, things don't work out perhaps exactly as he was hoping, and this all ends with an indiscretion the day before he leaves to go back to Toronto to his wife and 4 daughters. On his way back, he finds out there's one Catholic church left in the country, and he asks if he can visit it on the way to the airport. And so that's the sequence I'm going to read to you from now. First time to see Kanisat al-Himar al-Mukhadis, the driver said. Is that the name of the place where we're going? Asked Prin. It's what we call it here, said the driver. And what's the translation in English? Asked Prin. Hard to put into English, said the driver. Give it a try. Okay, my English is not so good when it's not stuff about driving, okay? But Kanisat al-Himar al-Mukhadis, I think it would be something like the Church of the Holy Ass. So then, okay, well, how does this figure in the crucifixion? Do you know? Perhaps it's named for the donkey that brought Christ into Jerusalem on Passover? Yes, okay. Very holy place for Christians. Tremendously holy, as you Americans say these days. But not donkey. I mean, you know. Oh, I'm sure there's something a little lost in the translation. Also, I'm Canadian. Congratulations, said the driver. They didn't speak for the rest of the trip. Along the way, on either side of the narrow road, there was broken up here and there, beside our narrow road, There were metal boxes and clumps of yellow-green shrubbery. There was laundry, bed sheets, tunics, tablecloths, hanging on lines in the hot, dead air. He could even make up the smudge marks of last night's fires in a few places. Prin saw no people at all. Were they all at work? Or were they also hiding? From what? At the foot of the mountain, the van came under sudden shade, and they turned off into a parking area half full of other vans. Prin's driver made it clear he was going to sit on a bench under a clump of mopey midget palm trees and play games on his phone until Prin returned from the chapel. And so he walked forward by himself. Here, sun and shadow were at odds in close quarters. The sun lit up long, jagged ruts and cuts, runnels that had gone dry along the mountainside. A few hundred paces away, and more in shadow than sun, sat a small, squat church carved into the mountain base where the cleft closed. Its facade was a mishmash of bas-relief eastern domes and classical columns beneath a cross that looked like big, dry biscuits laid upon one another at 90 degrees. Prin pinched his phone's screen to get an extreme close-up of the cross. "Stop!" said a man. Not just a man, a monk. He was big, broad, and dressed in black and wore a hammer-thick silver cross under his big bird's nest of a beard. He was standing just ahead, arms crossed, beside where the line to get into the church began. God's very own bouncer. The monk pointed to a sign nailed into the rock wall beside him. "We must preserve the holiness of this site. No pictures," it said in various languages. He then jerked his thumb to the side, to a gift stall staffed by two vacant-faced women in black kerchiefs. "Buy pictures there when you leave," he said. "No," said another monk, who emerged from the other side of the line. He was as barreled and grim-faced and nest-bearded, only he wore his silver cross on a jute-colored cassock. "Buy pictures there when you leave." He pointed to another little gift stall, just up from the first one. It was staffed by two vacant-faced women wearing jute-colored kerchiefs. Prin nodded at both monks, who were now glaring at each other, and slipped his phone into his pocket. He walked on, joining other pilgrims lined up to enter the chapel. Directly in front of him was a large group of Africans, all of whom were dressed in bright blue jumpsuits and carrying white umbrellas. Two turned, smiled, and nodded at him, sweat beading down their faces. They leaned in, and Prin smelled floral cologne and Lux soap. They wore name tags that read, "I'm Blessed Bruce," and "I'm Blessed Roy." "Hello," Prin said. "Blessed and blessings to you," said Bruce. "Blessed and blessings to you," said Roy. "Thank you," said Prin. "Is this your first time visiting the Holy Church?" "I'm Blessed Bruce," asked him. "Yes. Can you explain why the church is called, well, at least according to my driver's translation, 'Hello, boss'? You have questions? You would definitely like a tour guide. I spent a day with Harrison Ford when they filmed in Indiana Jones here. Han Solo! You would like to skip the line? Don't worry. I'm government certified and can arrange everything totally for free. No cost at all. Guaranteed 110%. I just want to practice my English. Come with me. Are you from England? Manchester, you. Princess Kate. Princess Meghan. A loud, small, smiling man had appeared out of nowhere. He was bony and a little gristly, his clothes old and threadbare, his sandals mere notions of footwear. He wore a lot of lanyards, all of which appeared to hold formal credentials of one kind or another. "Can you tell me why this church has this name?" Prin asked. "Of course, I can explain everything," the guide said. He took Prin's wrist very gently. Then he closed his grip and pulled. "Welcome to the Church of the Holy Seat, which is one of the most important historical sites in all of the world and a source of greatest national pride here in Dragomans. As to why this church is of greatest significance, there are several reasons, many dating back centuries and even Millennium Falcon. Sorry, Star Wars joke. I made it with Harrison Ford and he loved it. Now, to begin our exploration, I would like to read the following statement by our president regarding the importance of preserving our innovative heritage. He declares, sorry, I've got to catch a flight. Is there a pamphlet or something I can look at, and can we go in now? The guide nodded. Why wouldn't anyone let him give his speech? His wife and mother thought it was excellent. At least his mother did. That's a deeply autobiographical line, I will say. Of course we can still go in, but please understand, with a wife and children to support and also a mother, if I can't practice my English on you, then there's a small fee for me to arrange everything. What if I don't pay? Asked Prin. No problem, boss. Nice to meet you. Enjoy your visit to the church and the rest of your time here in beautiful Dragomans. Like us on the Facebook, and please tell all your friends in English to visit Dragomans. Now, sir, please be pleased to return to the line, and I'm required to call the brother over there if you don't respect the rules. Prin took out his wallet. My wife just had a new baby. Jaundice, the tour guide said. Prin gave him a $20 bill and didn't wince, not particularly, when the tour guide looked shocked. He beamed to himself, then at Prin, before running off to the gift stalls and returning with 2 poorly photocopied pamphlets. They were histories of the church, exact copies of each other, with certain words underlined or crossed out in one, and the opposite set underlined and crossed out in the other. And now, distinguished, honored guest, welcome to the Church of the Holy Seat. Perhaps he'd been mishearing the entire time. If this was the Church of the Holy See, then maybe it had a special papal significance dating to St. Peter. Or perhaps it was a holy see, somewhere else Christ had walked on water in one of the apocryphal Gospels. Holding the pamphlets, Prynne followed the guide inside. He felt like a running back moving behind a blocker as the guide pushed through the people colliding everywhere in the back of the church. Eventually, they were organized into two sort of lineups approaching the holy site located behind the main altar. According to 2 millennia of pious tradition, the church was founded on the site where a young man who had been a follower of Jesus came after escaping the Garden of Gethsemane during Christ's arrest. As the Gospel of Mark recounted, the young man left the garden so fast he dropped his loincloth, which was all he had been wearing. According to pious tradition, naked the young man ran and ran and ran out of Jerusalem and across Egypt, across the desert of Lehabim, and finally into Dragomans. Naked and terrified, he finally reached a cleft in a great mountain where he found a rock ledge, sat down, and wept. He wept knowing he had abandoned his Lord in his time of trial, and knowing what had happened to Christ while he ran away, knowing what God had allowed to happen to his only Son for the sake of all weeping, fleeing, terrified humanity. And according to pious tradition, this nameless and naked young man wept so much, the rock ledge beneath him softened from all of his tears and took on the shape of his seated body, buttocks, which remained there until his death. 4 centuries later, all that remained of this young man was a mound of gray dust resting upon the ledge in the cleft of the mountain. Now, one day, 2 men who were part of a new order of desert monks happened to be traveling through these mountains, seeking a spot for the monastery they planned to found together. They came to this cleft, and one of them, as to which the pamphlets emphatically differed, swept this gray dust off the ledge before sitting down to rest and see whether from this ledge he could observe the greatness of God and contemplate it for the rest of his days. Upon sweeping away the dust and sitting down, the monk discovered this holy seat, buttocks, imprinted with the mark of the naked young man of Mark's Gospel, who had fled from his Lord's side and wept unto his own death, having abandoned his God and feeling terrified that his God would abandon him. But God did not abandon him. Instead, God led this pious monk, again to which one the pamphlets emphatically differed, to the place where the naked young man had stopped running and sat down. And because both monks claimed for the rest of their lives to have been the first to have swept away the dust and discovered the imprint of the holy seat and sat there, and because each likewise claimed to have recovered all the young man's ashes and kept them in a sacred urn, 2 rival orders of monks were founded that day. And for 16 centuries since, these orders have shared custody of the church built around the holy seat. It was a small, dark place, and the air was close with many bodies and drying, dying flowers and guttering candles. What natural light there was came in through a series of bar-shaped openings cut into the main facade of the church. These threw just enough light down onto the floor to reveal a blue-white spread of mosaic tiles that occupied the center of the church's floor at the beginning of the nave. Many tiles were missing, all were faded, but Prynne could still make out the image of a naked young man, artfully concealed, his head down, one hand resting upon his brow as he sat on stone and sobbed. Very few people were actually praying before the altar on the 2 or 3 little benches set up there. Instead, everyone was lined up along the aisles waiting for their chance to venerate the holy seat, and in the meantime leaving flowers and lighting candles at all the little apse shrines to them along the way. Now that he was in a church and could at last pray, Prynne didn't know what to pray for. He thought again of those little metal houses he'd seen on his way to the chapel. Where were those people? Were they hiding? Were they running away? There were so many such people now, then, always, including Prynne, including the naked young man of the Gospel. But some didn't hide or run away. A little Spanish girl singing the Magnificat before the conquering Moors. As a boy, Prynne had read about her in a comic book Saint's Life. Did she really keep singing after they chopped her head off? Until her voice was muffled by the great beating of the pure white doves escaping from her open neck? There were so many such saints' lives, crazy holy men and women boiled and split and scalped, left to broil on the belly of a giant metal pagan pig god, and hammered against this spiked wall, dragged upon the floor of that lion-filled chamber, and in through it all, the saints are all still singing, never denying, always praising God. Some had been seen by hundreds looking beatific, their brown eyes turning virgin blue in Midland, Ontario, or while kneeling before floating golden chalices bearing the bloody heart of Christ in Hackborn and Helfta in Haifa. And when, whether right away or at long last, these saints died and went to the greater reward, people came to these places, cross-covered dovecotes in Andalusia, and bum-shaped stone ledges in Dragomans, and prayed there, waited there with candles and flowers until those in charge finally caught up and built a church. He dropped down upon the cracked mosaic floor, closing his eyes to say something, anything, to ask for something, anything, to hear anything. Did he? Was it? Was it yes that he felt God pulling him here and not for him alone, but for all of these other people? But then the guide, who was hopeful of getting a second $20 bill on the way out, grabbed him under the armpits and heaved him forward so he could hurry up and get to the front of the line. Front of the line, here you go, the tour guide said. He was shushed by the jute monk managing the line on the other side of the holy seat. The black monk standing near Prince shushed back his counterpart, who squared up and glared. The monks gestured back and forth at their chests and crosses and lineups, and then the jute monk pointed violently at a young man in front of Prin, who was thin and troubled-looking. His hands held forth in supplication. The young man was approaching the holy seat on his knees, very slowly. The jute monk crossed to the black monk's side and pushed the young man's shoulder to get him to hurry up so the next pilgrim, the jute monk's pilgrim, could have his turn. The black monk didn't like this at all. They bumped back and forth, chest to chest, umpire and manager, crosses clinking like nails being hammered, while they accused each other of lies and deceits that went back hours and days and days and centuries. The whole time the young man kept inching along on his knees. Prince saw the next person in line on the jute side whisper to his buddy. He was a long young man in white patterned shorts and a LeBron James jersey. Prince saw him take a long steel cylinder out from behind him. Oh God, a rifle! Oh no, a selfie stick. He stole ahead and sat down in the holy seat. He struck a man-spreading pose that revealed the pattern on his shorts was actually a blonde woman in a bikini who stretched across his hips. He held the selfie stick in front of him, grinned, and snapped away. The monks stopped fighting and together chased the young man off the holy seat and out of the church. The young man's friend followed after them, laughing and recording it all with his phone. With the monk gone, the tour guide took Prin by the arm, stepped over the kneeling man still making his way forward, and pushed him towards the holy seat, where Prin got down on his knees. Not knowing what else to do, and really not liking the theological implications of kissing this particular piece of sacred space, he placed a hand on the smooth, slight indenture in the stone, and on the smooth, slight indenture in the stone, where he prayed that he be given the courage and grace never to run away from God again. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Really wonderful, and so unique and such an interesting voice that you bring to all your work. I thought I would ask just one question of each, having read you and having get to know some of you, and then maybe see if there's questions from the group. I'm going to start with, I think, since we started with Phil, so I've been reading Phil's work and teaching some of those stories as well. And there's something about the way, even when you speak, I love it, the way that you make description almost these beautiful litanies. And it came out again in your reading today of just the medical, the precision, the almost kind of like craftsman-like work of the ordinary life, if there's anything ordinary about military life, the ordinary life as almost something with the aura of faith or the aura of a kind of sacredness. And I see that you've done that in your short stories, and it's certainly coming out here. So that was just a question. Do you do a really good job of the mundane with the holy, I think. Any comments on that?
Well, it's one thing that I wonder about that narrator's his opening, which I also thought about reading but didn't, begins with him talking about his father, who was a miner, and how his father had sort of always believed that doing hard work, physical work, was a way of quieting yourself and fastening your mind to God. And then one of the questions that he has is whether the physical work that he does can be considered like that, or whether actually what he's doing is something profane. Because the nature of his work, he's a medic, but he's also doing a lot of violence and party to a lot of violence. And, I think that ritual, it's sort of funny, I think that, especially if you're sort of like a overeducated person this day and age, we think of faith as this thing that happens in the head, right? And I don't think that is. I have relatives whose faith is very, they have like, there's praying circles of protection around you, and they know like the saints who aren't as popular, so they're not as busy to pray to for particular things. And there's a way in which among certain crowd who I spend a decent amount of time with, were they to see that, they would look at it in a sort of patronizing way about these people, and as like that's a sort of silly thing. And actually the kind of but as I get older, it's actually the aspects of Catholicism that seem maybe sillier, that I appreciate more. The importance of ritual, that faith is not something that happens inside your head, that, as the opening that I read, being a person is not something that just happens inside your head. It is you are a physical body moving through the world, interacting with other people, and if we don't consciously accept rituals, if we don't take them upon ourselves and try and structure our lives around rituals, it's not that we will then live a life devoid of ritual. It's that this society that we live in will provide us its own rituals, which we will accept unconsciously, and which I think are destructive of what is human and sacred about us.
Wow, thank you. You talked about the word faith, and the first time I ever heard about you was I think you were interviewed on NPR or something like that, and you were talking about faith, and you said faith for you was like a longing, and I just thought, do you remember saying that? that faith is a kind of a sense of longing for something, and that was a kind of a way into these characters that you, especially in your short story collection to New Mexico, this kind of a longing for something, not just quite there. Can you speak a little bit more about how you understand faith as a kind of an element or a part of a character's desires, their longings?
Sure. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I said. This one?
Yeah.
Just in both. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what I said at the time. But I mean, for me, faith it is longing. It's this longing to get closer to this infinite that I will never reach. I mean, I am mortal. I am, tiny and small-minded and small-hearted, and I will never be able to reach that kind of infinite, and yet I continue to look toward it and to do my best. It's very clumsy, right? But I do think, in fiction, it's longing is what drives the story. It's characters' desires that drive the story. The characters need to be seen and to direct their lives and to be fully human on the page. And
it certainly seems in the Night of the Fiestas that those always are, there's like a convergence of longings and this kind of salvific kind of sense of the land, the place, the shrine, the performance of the faith that kind of comes together, and so that one's deeper longings seem to be somehow wrapped up and implicated in those other religious kinds of longings. Yeah, it's wonderful.
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, so much of my fiction, I mean, not the pieces I read today, but a lot of my fiction does take place in northern New Mexico in Hispanic families, and I cannot separate my understanding of that place from Catholicism and from those the ritual and the rituals are these ties that keep my sense of family together and also keep the stories close.
Thank you. And then Randy, we have to take issue with Randy because Randy gave his first time he said that he was tired of Flannery O'Connor was actually at this at Loyola University. We still take issue with you saying that, but but of course, meaning that he was looking for this panel actually, artists and writers who were not looking at something in the past, but that this was a living and breathing piece. But reading print and stuff like that, I was very much aware that it's like you found Evelyn Waugh's kind of you've got this, for someone who doesn't like Flannery O'Connor, you have this chorus of writers who were Catholic. You're so brilliant. You're coursing through your imagination and reading the whole original print and knowing that it's just one of three, kind of almost a cliffhanger kind of ending. Maybe because I teach Catholic writers, but I was like, oh my God, that's a Grand Prix. Oh my God, that is Flannery O'Connor. But I wonder, because it was a new thing, right? So we were doing a new thing. So I'm just talking about how has those writers, those that you've written about, that you are now, how are they part of this kind of like cheering band? I don't know if they are a cheering group or they're a judgment group on you.
It's like a writer's circle made of a cloud of witnesses. I think that the big change that happened with this novel, the first in a trilogy, was I think I was, which is my third novel. My first two were kind of, in pretty straightforward ways, kind of satires of Canadian multiculturalism, or a big sort of 100-year South Asian epic story of one man in an island, et cetera, et cetera. And they were well received, and I'm very committed to them still. But my faith life was very much sort of off to the side in all of this, I guess you could say. And at that point, I was still, I think as you pointed out, I was still sort of frustrated that, and I suspect we've all had this experience, anytime you're at a dinner party or an event with anyone who finds out that you're a Catholic writer, I just go in my head, 3, 2, 1, do you like Flannery O'Connor? And then you wait, here comes Chesterton, and then it just starts, right? And I know, he's really great. He's very clever, that Chesterton. Anyway, I grew very sick of this on one side, and then I realized that there had to be a kind of a way through. But I didn't get there on my own. And I think maybe the key thing to point out here about that engagement with the writers you mentioned was the original version of this novel was 600 pages long, and I gave it to my editor, who's a 78-year-old Englishman. Doesn't use a computer, everything is handwritten on embossed letterhead. And he said to me, Randy, you think you are writing a John Irving novel, this big rambling thing. And he said, you're not. You're writing a Kingsley Amis novel. You're writing an Evelyn Waugh novel. But you won't admit it for some reason. And so he put me on think about this, writers and editors in the room, he put me on a reading diet. He said, don't touch this. For the next 6 months, I want you to read the following books. And it was Green, it was Waugh, it was early V.S. Naipaul, it was Beryl Bainbridge. It was a series of kind of mid-century comic English novels, frequently with a kind of Catholic sensibility to them. And then he said, now tell me, is that really what you're trying to do here? And I read those novels, I think, in a fresh way. Of course, I knew them all. I teach them, I love reading them, but I never thought of them as being in as full a sense of dialogue with what I was trying to do until then. And I think that's what led to losing 400 pages, and you're welcome. And then
That's great. And we look forward to the next two. So I want to just open up to questions from the group. If you have anything to ask, and maybe you all can share in these questions and answers together.
So I love all of your work, and each of you in different ways are trying to grasp at the pursuit of holiness in characters' lives. And I think especially in this day and age where people don't really believe in goodness in people, right? They're okay with the ugliness or the infernal, but when it comes to somebody who actually wants to be good, or even beyond that, wants to be holy, there's something about us that becomes skeptical or disbelieving, or like you said, Phil, it becomes silly to try that. So how do you struggle with that when you're writing? What does holiness look like in your narratives? How do you go about doing that?
You want to go first?
Just throw her under the bus.
Exactly.
Looks like hiding in trees and screaming that you can smell people's sin. Is that how you conduct classes?
Typically, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a problem, and you know, it is funny, especially in a lot of literature. There's an emphasis on like trauma, right? Trauma is something we're very comfortable with. It feels more scientific, even the terminology. Holiness and joy, not so much. And part of the problem that I have with this is, well, let me put it in a step back a stage. There's a thing that you'll find among veterans, right? Where they've been in a place where the stakes are life and death. And they'll come back to modern American life and they'll say everything here is bullshit, right? If you've seen The Hurt Locker, when the guy goes into the grocery store and there's just like all these choices of cereal and he's like, oh, like that, veterans love to hate on that movie, but that scene a lot of people love, right? And it's like, everything here is bullshit and over there is where the real stuff is, right? And why is the real stuff there? Because people are dying there, right? And so everything has this feeling of importance. And yet, first off, real life is hard. I have a buddy for whom his hardest leadership challenge came not in Afghanistan or Iraq, but when his unit's deployment got canceled because of all of his guys who were just expecting that they were going to be able to put real life on hold and say, sorry, I'm in Afghanistan, I can't deal with that. All of a sudden, we're going to have to be back at home, being a person. And there's a way in which like that sort of sense of meaning is so vital because you're seeing, because there's brutal things happening around you, that you lose that sense of meaning. It's almost like you're sort of injecting meaningfulness straight into your veins, right? It's like if metaphor I always use, if you like over salt the living shit out of your food, I could take you to the best restaurant in the world and you're just gonna be like, needs more salt. It's like, no, like your palate is screwed up, right? And I think that, but what's actually happening is the reason that the loss of life means something is because the normal life of people back home, raising a family, taking care of their kids, loving someone, being a member of a community, that is sacred and that is deeply important, and that's why we feel that sense of meaning. But we've sort of lost a language for it, and it feels like we can only recapture it in the negative when we're talking about the destruction of those things. And it feels more certain, you know? There's a reason that, like, you know, Peter Singer likes to base his utilitarianism on suffering, right? Because it seems like there's no objective language that we can use to talk about joy. And yet, if we only base everything on suffering, we cut out what makes that suffering meaningful, we cut out why it matters, and we cut out what makes us human. And yeah. And I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's talking about these things without ever losing sight of the fact that just trauma alone, just suffering alone, does not justify itself, and it becomes a sort of trauma pornography very, very easily.
Yeah. For me, you know, this search, seeking holiness is, I mean, it's right at the center of my work, and I think it's why I write. I think the biggest challenge for me in my actual life and also on the page is seeing holiness in other people, and that is the task that I have as a human in the world and as a writer writing about characters who are complicated, who I may dislike or disagree with, and it's recognizing the holiness in them and their complexity. And I fail at it all the time on the page and in real life. But it's the task that I try to keep at the forefront of my mind.
I'll just say very, very quickly to add to that, maybe speaking to your earlier query as well, Mark, one way that I think I found access to writing about holiness was to think about sort of ordinary holiness. So this is obviously in many ways a cracked autobiographical novel, and I have a wife and 4 children. And one of the criticisms of my work in the past has been, these are really good performances, but you're nowhere in there. It's all coming out of this in some ways. And so I really opened myself to writing about family life in this book, having 4 small children and thinking about the kind of daily life and what it means to lead a good and meaningful life based on kind of durable truths on a day-to-day basis. And for Prynne, the great temptation is, I want to go to the Middle East. I want to do something really exciting, because that's where something real would be, as opposed to curriculum committee and making sure my kids don't do breakdance moves in church or something like this. But it's in fact, the effort of the book, and then of the 2 books that'll follow it, will be to say, no, it's actually in both, right? And and an integrated life is a discernment of where it is in both, as opposed to the kind of romanticizing of one over the other.
We said 12:35 for finish, so we have like 9 minutes, just so you know.
Hi. I'm going to ask a question that brings the conversation, I hope, to a more specific kind of sense of what the Catholic imagination is. I spent the last 5 years writing a book on the afterlife from the point of view of lots of different religions, from the Neanderthals on and way beyond religion, as a matter of fact. And so I'm very, at this point, saturated with religious imagination, okay? And I respect greatly your writing and the words that you have given us, wise words. But is there something in your writing, and any of you could answer this, that you see as specifically Catholic? I mean, all religious people long for God. All religious people feel in graced moments that there is a presence that is paying attention to them. All religions try to make sense of suffering, etc. I'm just thinking, what do we have? We have Jesus. We have the incarnation. We have the cross. We have the resurrection. And you may think of other things that are very specifically Catholic. But is there something, are there any things that are specifically Catholic that move you, that you look to as a source for inspiration?
I'll speak just directly to that, because it just happened last week. Once a week at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, where I teach, the faculty have lunch together. And let's say majority of the faculty would be Catholic of various stripes and relationships to the church, but then certainly some non-Catholics as well. And we had this whole lunchtime conversation. I think it was about Philip Neri's arm, because Philip Neri's arm was coming through town, and there was this whole conversation. Are you going to go see Neri's arm? Are you going to go to Lourdes? Where are you going for that? I'm going to Rose of Lima. And just all this small talk. And I watched my colleague, who's kind of post-Anglican, let's say, just sitting there in the middle of all of us, talking about this arm that was kind of moving around the Greater Toronto area. And when are you going to go? Are you taking the kids? Yeah, they love arms. That's the Catholic imagination, is the fact that is all entirely normal, right? But the thing is, for a writer, it's being a step removed and watching this one colleague who is freaked out and wondering if he should go apply for a job elsewhere, as he's listening to his otherwise regular old professor colleagues talking about the arm and where are they going to go visit the arm. That's one. It's incarnational. We certainly heard it, and I think in our work very much so. It bodies in your work, as I certainly noticed it. But then, so there's that, and then the sort of stuff that Mark has written about, I think very persuasively, about the sacramental imagination. I think that would kind of name it in a more scholarly way. But just think about an arm, and think about what we do with an arm.
You guys want to answer that? Respond to that?
Yeah, for me, attention to ritual the Sacramental, to the sense of the world as not mere matter, but actually being charged with meaning. For me, the Sacrament of Reconciliation is very important. A rite of forgiveness. It doesn't necessarily always come out in explicitly Catholic ways, but that's certainly and you're not allowed to despair. You're not allowed to despair. Yeah.
Another question?
No, it's okay.
sorry.
No, it's okay.
Please go, please, please, please.
I mean, I was just going to say that for me, so much of the Catholic imagination is this engagement with these layers upon layers of story. I mean, there is,
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
you know, there's the crucifixion and the resurrection, which is, you know, this sort of kernel, and then there's all of the stories of the saints and everybody crowding around, and there's the, you know, I just spent last year in Rome, and so I've been steeped in story and art, and you know, the countless paintings and retellings of these stories, and the different versions, and then the stories of how, you know, relics come to be where they are. I mean, it's just this rich and complicated and contradictory layering of story that I think that feels very Catholic, at least in my understanding, and really attracts me.
There's a line from Andre Dubus's second story, A Father's Story, which is you know, my daughter's like sort of sympathetic to paganism, but that's okay. Like Catholicism includes bits of paganism, like onions in the stew, you know. And I love those saint stories, and the wildness and the strangeness of them is part of this sort of admission of just this incredible diversity and multiplicity of ways to approach holiness, and which seems so at odds with a kind of more instrumentalized, rationalized society where you sort of, you know, syllogistically come to sort of one manner of how you're supposed to be.
You know, reading all three of your works, it's, to put it in my language, it's just participation in Christ. It's not be like him, but become, be formed, be shaped. Whether it's the the man who wants to be the crucified person in your short stories, or your characters who are kind of trying to figure out sainthood, their own, which just means basically sanity in the midst of chaos, or this, you know, this feeling of having to go through to go through the crucifixion, not as something that's totally mine. But I'm participating in something. It's Hopkins, right? It's Hopkins, and then I do think that I think Christ not so much as an idea or an ideal, but as me.
Yeah.
And I think that's Catholic and Sacramental.
Is there just one more record? Oh, okay. And thank you all very much, and I really enjoyed all of them. This is a question especially for Phil, but if anybody has some thoughts on it, I'd love to hear them. So as a writer, I'm recently out of the Army myself, and there are two difficulties that I've run into in sort of working on some stuff. I'm working on a project that's basically resetting Dante's Inferno to America through the eyes of an Afghanistan veteran. And the first difficulty is sort of translating these experiences and the in-jokes that are true, like this Shepherd Fable, to a civilian audience. And to the feeling of betraying those friends that you serve beside by critiquing either the macro or the micro policies that, and even the flag that they've dedicated their lives and their service to. So yeah, I was wondering if you've experienced those and sort of those difficulties, how you sort of go through them.
Yeah. I wrote Redeployment with a little bit of terror and like a sort of imaginary line of veterans waiting to kick my ass if I screwed it up. But also like this sense that if I wrote it and there were not some veterans who wanted to kick my ass, I would have failed, right? Write it honest, right? Write it honest before you try and write it good. That's having something that I really wanted to say was the most important thing. And, you know, you don't respect somebody by patronizing them. You respect them by taking them seriously and trying to communicate with them as honestly and as rigorously as you can. And I don't know any more honest or rigorous way to communicate them by writing fiction, because it's not a vehicle for the transmission of didactic points or ideas. It's an experience that you're inviting somebody to enter into. And so I would say, you know, and while you write it, you know, you write something and nobody needs to see it when you first write it. You know, I wrote a story that begins with some there's a story in the book called In Vietnam They Had Whores, which is pretty aggressive in a variety of ways. And I wrote it with this idea, I'm just going to talk about some of the ugliest stuff, especially more story about screwed up masculinity than it is about war. And then I looked at it and I was like, oh crap, I think it's good. My grandma's gonna see this, you know? Put yourself out on that limb first, just write it, don't worry about that. And then, you know, you make your determinations. As far as translating in jokes or whatever, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I wrote one story that's almost entirely in acronyms. But trust the reader. And then just, you know, have somebody who's a civilian read it, and, you know, if they're I had no clue what's going on, maybe throw in a few more clues, right? But, you know, write it straight, write it honest, write it as close to the voice that you want, and then share it with people and see, you know, what strikes them when they read it, and that'll help you. Yeah. Good luck.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very, very much. What a great...
Really fun.